Let's test these 6 watercolor papers while on this Alaskan cruise. Will these papers survive this odyssey, or will they trigger Poseidon's wrath? After testing out these 6 different watercolor papers in my studio, I went on a week-long cruise to Alaska with my family from the West Coast and from Texas. I didn't really know what to expect, but because I was planning to paint anyway, I decided to just bring along these 6 papers and see how they actually perform in a real-world situation. In any case, it would be more fun than painting squares in my studio. A couple of caveats before I begin. I had to pack light. I could only bring these papers and this small board. I brought my Daniel Smith paints and a few small brushes, but basically I had to keep it pretty spare for the trip. Also, because I'm not painting in the studio, it's a little hard to have some sort of systematic approach, so expect to see some different scenes and different subject matters, but I'll try to apply some similar techniques across all of them just to sort of keep some semblance of a comparison going. Also, I'm trying to keep this a fun vacation, so I want to enjoy the scenery and I do want to paint stuff that is really fun for me, so come along for the ride and I hope you enjoy this test. After exploring the ship a bit on our first day at sea, I soon realized that the wind made painting outside not a great option. In this first painting session, I used the Fabriano Artistico paper. My first painting was this attempt to capture the view out a window in the game room. Here I'm wetting down the paper all the way from top to bottom, and I'm using the Daniel Smith Prussian blue to lay down a wet on wet wash. And then I use my brush and also the paper towel to lift out some cloud shapes and also eventually to do the railing and the cables. You can see the shaking, that's from the boat. And I'm using the paper towel to lift out shapes of clouds from the sky. And here I'm adding the perylene green to capture the gradient in the color of the water. That's the horizon. And I'm adding some waves at the bottom. The surface of the water that's closest to us deserves a little bit more definition, so I'm laying on the paint a little bit more thick, and I'm not worried too much about the contrast. Here I'm lifting out the railing, the top railing, and it's lifting out pretty nicely. And I just go over it a few times, wiping my brush onto my paper towel each time. Now I'm lifting out the vertical railings. By now the surface has dried a little bit more, so it's a little bit harder to lift out the line, but it's still coming off. And I'm careful to wipe my brush on the paper towel in between every few strokes so that I'm not just rubbing paint back onto the paper. Here I'm adding some darks to the railings and the cables. I created a darker color by just adding some burnt umber to the mix that I already have in my well. And there's a little bit of texture in the cabling, so I'm okay with the stroke being a little rough. If you stick around until after the 6 paintings are completed, I'm going to share my thoughts on how each paper performed after they've all dried. In my second painting session, I used the Baohong. This is on day 2 on the way to Juneau, Alaska. And I found a spot in the dining area before most people were up, and I saw these amazing views. It was an endless procession of dark masses against the sky that was gradually getting brighter. You can see the wet on wet wash here. And then I'm using some cobalt blue for the sky. I left some areas for the cloud cover. I also added some of the grays that I mixed up into the clouds to show the shadow sides. Here I'm adding paint in different values in the sky, trying to give the sky a little bit more interest, and I'm adding some blues to show some of the sky in the back. And I'm kind of just moving the paint around, adding darks where I felt like it's needed, and just trying to keep the sky looking a little bit more interesting and not as flat. And I'm adding some more darks to the land mass after it's dried a little bit more. I have a little bit more control now since it's dried. It's still not completely dry, but dry enough to have a little bit more control. Here I'm adding some blues to the foreground, the areas closest to the window. And this part is a fun part because the background has dried and I'm adding some very saturated darks to show the land masses that are basically smack dab in the middle of the scene, which will help round out the image. And this is a combination of perylene green mixed in with some of the blues and the burnt sienna, sorry, the burnt umber that's in my paint well already. As this landmass is closer to us, it's good to have these sharper edges. And I also added some sap green to show the sides of the hills that were illuminated by the sun peeking through the clouds. I'm still getting used to the landscapes before me. It always takes a few sessions for me to begin getting comfortable with new sights. I'm not really used to seeing so much sky and land all at once, let alone trying to capture it from a moving ship. And I'm removing the tape, and I always love to do that and see how the border turned out. For my third painting session, I painted on this Stonehenge Aqua paper. So on day 3, we headed to Glacier Bay National Park. There were so many beautiful scenes along the way. And in this painting, I wanted to show these mountaintops starting to get some morning sun and the land masses getting progressively darker towards the foreground. Here I put down a wet on wet wash of Prussian blue for the water. I tried to indicate some patterns with my brush. I used a good amount of water. You'll see me kind of repeatedly returning to the well, trying to gauge how much paint to put down onto the wet paper. While I'm painting, I'm also half looking out the window, keeping an eye out for patterns in the water that I can establish. I used burnt sienna to show the mountaintops and the light, then used shades of blue for the midground layer, and then added some burnt umber to the blue to darken the land. And for the sky, I added grays for the shaded areas of the clouds and used some Hansa yellow medium to create some highlights. I'm learning to pay attention to where the ocean meets the land because sometimes there's a bright sliver of water that looks basically like a border, and I'm careful to use my brush to establish the edge of the dark areas and try to raise the contrast to make it look brighter in that thin stretch of water. So I'm careful to kind of leave an exposed area of paper here. Whenever I need to add more soft layers of color, I re-wet the area with water before painting inside of it, being careful not to brush outside the wet area. This helps the paint dry in a diffused manner, and it's a pretty effective way to create overlapping soft layers of color. And I'm also using some dry brush strokes in the water to add reflections that are closer to us and even more on the surface of the water. Obviously, I'm back in my studio, but if you've enjoyed this video so far, would you give me a thumbs up? And if you enjoyed seeing my cruise painting journey by the end of this video, would you consider subscribing to show your support? Thank you so much. Now back to the cruise. So for the fourth painting session, it was actually my second painting session of that same day. where I did number 3. After arriving in Glacier Bay and viewing some crumbling ice falls, I grabbed a spot by the windows to try and capture the Marjorie Glacier. And even though the ship was going to stop there for an hour, it already took off a few minutes into my painting, so I had to complete the rest of it based on a video that I took. This painting involved a wet on wet wash of Prussian blue and adding some burnt umber to create darker shades of gray and some perylene green for the planes that are closer to us, but overall the painting is relatively cool. Just before I started this session, we were standing on the rear deck taking in the glacier and the crowd started rumbling. Then we saw a massive section of ice slide off into the sea. I've only ever seen that in films and it was breathtaking, but it was also strange that so many people cheered. It was a sad moment, honestly, but the sun was shining brightly and I guess it was inevitable. Session 5 was on day 6. This was another early morning session before breakfast at Ketchikan, Alaska. It was going to be a gray day and I set my sights along the side of the ship. It was an exercise of using muted blues and grays and then some green and yellow to bring some of the land masses forward. I wasn't able to record much video for this one because my phone was running out of storage. And also, sometimes you have to find ways to make a scene a little more interesting. I ended up waiting for a small boat to arrive in the harbor, and then I tried my best to capture that fleeting moment. We pulled out of Ketchikan, Alaska later the same day, and the weather was still gray, but a perfect 60 degrees, so I decided to get out my Luchetti sketchbook and paint on the rear deck. It was my first painting attempt outside there. Even though it's in a different category of paper, I felt like taking it for a spin. The gutterless feature of the sketchbook means that I can fold it out to 16:8 format, and it would be perfect for a landscape, and it would be easy to paint across the whole spread. I've already reviewed this one in previous videos, so you can check out how I've used the sketchbook before. It's not officially in this test of papers, but if you ever wonder if it's worth it to bring 300-pound paper while on vacation, I hope this video gives you a good reference point. Just a quick thought about plein air painting. I love painting outdoors because it teaches me a lot about so many things all at the same time. It's always a little bit of a challenge because of the elements. You don't have a nice desktop setup, and also everything dries faster, so it forces you to act faster. There's also the pressure of painting in front of others. That might take a little getting used to, but once you start painting, the rest of the world usually quiets down and you stop worrying about what others are thinking, and it gets easier with practice. Okay, let's get back to the paintings. For my 7th and final painting session, I made some more space on my phone, so I was able to record video again, and this last day was going to be the last full day on the cruise with a night stop in Victoria, British Columbia. For this 6th cotton paper test, I picked another starboard side so I wouldn't be directly in the sun, and I decided to paint a portrait of the sea this early morning. I'm using Prussian blue for the initial layer of water, and I remembered I should have started upside down so that the more saturated section would be toward the bottom of the scene, since the colors get richer as you approach the top of the sky and the areas closest to me. The challenge of painting the sea is the randomness of the waves and the perpetual motion. I have so much respect for the old painters who captured the sea. But for this demonstration, I found ways to establish enough pattern and movement to simulate that feeling. For me, it would have been futile to try and capture realistic waves. After laying down the water, I lifted out the horizon and just made sure to make that very faint, and it needed to be lighter than the water that's close to us. For the sky, I used cobalt blue as the wash, and I made sure to let it fade away towards the horizon. Just needed to have a perceptible edge at the horizon. And here I'm lightening that horizon again, trying to lift out as much as I can. Finally, I've turned the painting upside down so that I can re-wet the foreground. Basically, I'm re-wetting that so I can lay in some soft strokes of the Prussian blue. This way I can have more subtle movement in the water. I put in some more saturated blues for the dark sides of the waves. This way, re-wetting it and dropping the paint in helps to keep a diffused look and makes it a little bit more convincing as water. and it keeps it from looking like I just painted a layer on top of dry paint. And I'm careful to try to put the pigment into the wet areas and not cross over into dry areas, because I don't really want hard edges there. I've turned the painting right side up again, and I'm lifting out areas for the white foam. And this is stylized. I'm not trying to be super realistic, but I am observing, and I'm half looking up at the scene in front of me, half looking at the paper, just trying to find patterns and shapes that to me strike me as resembling the movement of the water in front of me. Even though the areas that I lifted out to show the white foam ended up being just barely perceptible, the difference in value is good enough for me. And we can see that the foreground values, they get progressively darker, and compared with the areas closer to the middle of the scene, closer to the horizon, that helps to portray a convincing view of the water. And with this painting done, I've finished painting on all 6 cotton papers that I tested in my last video. Once I'm back in New York, I'll go over the dried paintings and share some reactions, so stick around for that. It's the last night of the cruise. We're docked here in Victoria, British Columbia. We're going to be headed back to Seattle tomorrow and then back to New York City. I have to say it's been a wonderful experience, so much better than I had expected. We saw some incredible sights. We got to see glaciers, we got to see wildlife, and got to spend some great time with my family. I also got time in to paint. I have to say though that the painting was really just a tiny fraction of the time here on this cruise. The majority of my time I was unplugged from the world and from all my daily cares. I was spending time with my wife and son, my brothers and their kids who are growing up so quickly. I was spending time with my parents, and actually my paintings, I know they're going to serve as markers of this time that we spent together. We created these moments and memories, and I will forever cherish them. And I'm so happy that these paintings, even though they're simple tests of these papers, they're actually going to be important reminders for me. And that's the beauty of this thing that we do that's called art. So I'm going to wrap this up and go back to the cabin and pack. And when we get back to New York, I'm going to share some more thoughts on the paintings that I completed on this trip. It'll also be a fun reminder for me to go back over these moments that I captured. See you again soon. So I'm back in my studio in New York. I'm still relishing the vacation vibes, but now it's time to review the completed paintings. This is the Fabriano Artistico. Lifting worked well on this as I pulled out the shapes of the railing and the cables. The paper did buckle a lot and it seemed to take a while to dry, but it could have been the humidity of the ship. Otherwise, I have no complaints about what it felt like to paint on this paper. But I'm not so sure I like the final appearance of the paper. I like the painting itself, but I'm not so sure. The surface looks inconsistent to me, and I'm not totally keen on it. This is the Baohong paper. I'm kind of looking at it like a funny kid. It amuses me. I said before that it might be a distraction for me, this rough texture. And I'm actually kind of bothered by how the wet on wet wash looked in the end. I don't really like how it dried, so it's definitely not my favorite. Here's the Stonehenge Aqua paper. I noticed that it didn't buckle as much as the Baohong paper did when I wet the entire surface, and the finer texture made it easier to cover with paint. The paper's fibers do seem more apparent to me, and I felt like I had to be more careful to avoid going over an area too much to avoid some pilling. Also, when removing the tape stripped off the top layer of the paper. This kind of reminded me of their black paper that I've used before. It just feels really fragile. My main issue is that I'd be worried about damaging the paper while using it, but I think I like the look of it overall. So far, I like the appearance of the Stonehenge and the Fabriano Artistico more than the Baohong. This is the arches. To me, there's a clear difference in the final appearance. The paint dried evenly, the surface looks fresh. Granted, I did paint from a photo because this one I wasn't under the same time pressure as some of the other paintings, and so it might look a little bit more measured and the layers had time to dry. But if you look closely, the surface texture doesn't distract me and it's very even throughout. This is the Meeden paper. I was under a time crunch like the others where I had to paint before breakfast started, but I didn't like how the paper absorbed the paint too much. I think the way the wet on wet wash went on, it felt a little too spidery for me. Looking at it now, I feel the same way I felt in my initial test of this paper. For me, the texture of the paper stands out a little too much and it feels like the surface is pilling. Almost like certain areas that got too wet, they now look fragile and shaggy. This is the Fuumuui paper. I have to say that I was pleasantly surprised by this paper. Of all the papers, it seemed to handle my painting style most similarly to the way I paint on arches. After dried, I'm pretty pleased with its appearance. This may be a better alternative than I realized in my earlier test, and I'm going to paint on it some more to see if I can convince myself even further. Before the vacation vibes fade away, I just wanted to share one of the most touching things that I saw on my trip through Alaska. In the city of Ketchikan, we did the salmon walk where we got to see salmon swimming upstream. In that particular ring of the circle of life, we see odds stacked horribly against them. I got to witness the life force driving these fish through their own odyssey. I've heard that something like 1% of them make it safely back from the ocean to their birthplace. So we were seeing the 1%. Followed by calm waters further upstream, we saw dead fish along that stream, but I heard a nearby guide tell us, don't feel sorry for them. They were actually the successful ones. They returned and spawned, and then they died the way they were supposed to. The salmon struggling against the white waters moved me. How much of our lives do we spend in a similar struggle, and is that struggle worth it? Salmon migrate from fresh water to the oceans, and when it's time, they just know that their original birthplace is the best place to lay their eggs. They set out on this journey home instinctively, even though most of them won't make it. They're responding to their life's purpose, and even if they don't make it all the way home, it's a beautiful and humbling thing to witness. I hope you might have a chance to see it for yourself. If you're just getting started on your own watercolor journey or are looking for a simple approach to get back to watercolors after some time away, I've put together a free one-page chart of essential supplies. Just click on the link in the description to download it. I'm Francis Shui, a working artist based here in New York City. Like, share, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and hit the bell icon to get notified of future videos. And if you're interested in a print of any of these demonstrations, check out the link in the description. Until the next time, go and paint.